Um, and let's start at the bottom with Nathan today and go up.
Okay. I joined a little late, so I read the. Did the reading last night, but I only just started to scan the background piece, Venkat, that you'd mentioned. So thoughts are a little rough. I think so. First pass, just thinking about the paper. I find things like this really interesting. The decentralized pushes like this, but I don't know. I feel like I'm continually disappointed about how much legs any of these proposals has. I think there's really a huge amount of gravity towards that's just from path of least resistance. It's still very hard to run a server. It's still very hard to even run software on servers. Computers remain fairly mysterious to most people, and so anything that uses the word server in it, it is hard for me to imagine being something that actually recognizes the goals, if it actually takes off at all, decentralization. So color me skeptical, but also color me, intrigued. I think there's some interesting things in this. The project's obviously very early stage. They're still implementing a lot of things this document talks about, judging from their GitHub. One other thought. What I did get through in the background, I think it is interesting that the same origin policy keeps coming up as a villain. This is not the first time I've seen it in terms of driving centralization. I think the case for it driving centralization is pretty strong. And just to back up, same origin policy is a browser security policy that restricts what scripts can run and how scripts can communicate across domains. Cross-origin comes, or their same origin, sorry, not cross-origin. Same origin comes from a good place, though. Without it, it's very, very easy to exfiltrate data and to maliciously command a website on behalf of another user who may not even know that. So while same origin policy may be sort of a recurring villain of a lot of these pieces, you've got to either ditch things like JavaScript or you have to silo JavaScript, because as soon as you start running executable code that's cross origin, bad things start happening there. And I've just never seen a proposal that actually wrestles with that. So those are all my quick thoughts in terms of the prompt. The evolutionary competition between multiplayer shared brains and individual experiences. I think there's probably an iterative ratchet there. This is somewhat personal preference, I think, but I've never actually found multiplayer experiences particularly compelling as multiplayer experiences. And I still have doubt about how much they really bring to the table. But there is a ratchet effect where you sort of borrow from the experience back into the individual experience becomes fodder. So I think there's potentially a useful ratchet there, and figuring out a way to enable broader multiplayer experiences, Rome, but for the internet, which is kind of how I read this proposal, feels like potentially a very, very powerful thing, particularly if in this permission model, you can very selectively embed parts of other people's graphs in your own. So that strikes me as very interesting. And I don't think it's sort of a either or a competition. I think it's going to be very much a racket that can kind of drive both to potentially richer experiences. So that is my thoughts. Sorry for going on a little long there. I'll pass up. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce Naichi.
Yes. Okay. I think this question it depends on how the media works, how the media involves people in the multiplayer shared experience. I post a workcast link a little bit above, in which I replied to a person asking about whether open source code will become more of voluminous after GPT, and the discussion kind of boils down to whether there will be a kind of maintenance that pairs with the generation of the code. So you have something that generates many code, but you should also have something that governs the maintenance of that many code. So I think that this type of discussion also works on the multiplayer experience, because we usually don't have much time to maintain everything, especially things on Noosphere. We may make many notes on, let's say, a typical note app. But I don't think many people have the strength or have the capacity to maintain everything. So the maintenance part might need some automation or some protocol in that regard, to make things to make things easier for us. And on the other hand, that goes back to the media part. I think people can be aware and should be aware of these kind of developments. Actually, the type of technology that is possible, just knowing about it makes a difference. Just knowing about it makes me want to contribute to thinking about this problem. So I think it depends on how it is broadcasted, how this idea is broadcasted, and how people respond to it. Also, yeah. And that's about it. I think I'll hand it over to Meyer.
Yeah, thank you. I feel a disconnect between the title and the contents, and I'll explain why. Knowledge is something that's live, and this appears to be a protocol for sorts, not for sort. Sort is something that I do. Sorts is something that I wrote down in little notes that can be collected in spheres in the library, and other people can look at it. I believe our goal is to do that. And if you think about the difference between sorts and a sort, the flywheel is very different. When you have a real multiplayer interactive game, people are conversing with each other, and the system gets new value because of the people interacting on it. When you have a system with memos which people update when they update them, rather than getting updated automatically, don't ask me how, based on the travels they do in the system and the actual sort processes, you have a much slower flywheel happening, and I think they could do better. Now, as to the article itself, I get this feeling of the let's solve all the problems we have in the internet at once. And, it's very difficult to do that, and it's also very difficult to convince other people to use your protocol. And it seems to me like it's going to be one big mess, and that's why I did a thumbs down on the worldwide walls, because you just get a complete mess. Maybe we actually want something more like the Fediverse. In fact, I just read an article, I think Jenna published it, I'm not sure, that is trying to encourage artists to have their own website, because that gives them the ability to have a real presence and, controls the art and so on. In any case, what I really did miss is the whole question of how do you think together in groups? How big should these groups be? And when I look at the overall problem they're trying to solve, and I think, how do I compare this to a set of copies of ChatGPT? Each copy is trained on the entire internet. Well, each copy of ChatGPT is centralized, but since I have a lot of them, it becomes decentralized. And ChatGPT definitely, at least with text, doesn't have silos, and your information is not trapped, and all of these other information sharing things exist, except for perhaps trust and authentication. Now, what I did not see is competition between massive multiplayer and single experience. I don't know, I feel right now on the internet that I have a multiplayer experience. And perhaps something like the Gumps that Commits posted is a nice example. It is multiplayer. I know where other people are, but I don't really know what they're doing, so I'm not really interacting with them. So if I have to summarize my feeling, another guy who's trying to generate a protocol which will solve everything, even things we didn't know that needed to be solved, and even things that have simpler solutions. And the promise of user-owned medium for syncing together, and I'm emphasizing those words, I don't see that promise happening. So I am passing on to Grigori.
I will start with a prompt. In my view, it's an interesting question to ask about competition, but it's a little bit premature. And we can take a look, for example, at the first part of the prompt. Do we have a massively multiplayer shared second brain? And I think we don't have it. And the way the authors of the protocol and the article approach it seems to be wrong. On a very basic level, what is Noosphere? It's a rather vague concept. Compare it with another idea which is kind of stupid but more powerful. Landing on Mars. Mars is very specific. Landing on Mars is very specific. Populating Mars is very specific. Even so, it can be a stupid goal, but it's very specific. The noosphere is anything but. So we are taking a very vague goal and trying to solve it. And in this case, I would probably say that it's not going to be solved from this end. It can be probably solved from another end, which is try to form individual experiences and then ask a question. Can we actually connect individual experiences just for two people? Can we build a second brain first for one person, reliable second brain, useful second brain, not a meme that is attached to a book and a course for which you can pay, of course. So start with building a second brain for an individual, then try to connect two. And once you are successful at connecting two and building a combined second brain for two people, okay, invite another one. So it's P2P, person to person, and then person to person to person, and then person to person to person. And complexity will grow apparently, but probably there are some ways to overcome this growth of complexity. The other point was making is in the preceding article about redecentralization. There is a list of some characteristics of decentralization effort. And it is trust, data, infrastructure, attention, domain names. They are not on the same level, in my view. And to illustrate this, we can look at just two and figure out that there is interplay between time and attention. Trust and attention, sorry. For example, of course, I don't have enough attention to pay for everything. So then the question comes, can you trust another person or another entity or a company or a Wikipedia or Google? In those cases when I don't have time to pay attention, but I still want to get some value out of it. And if you can solve for this, then probably all the other issues on this list, data, infrastructure, domain name, is much more solvable. But just think about how hard it is to trust another person in case when you don't have enough attention to pay for a particular issue. And I will pass it on to Kamit.
I think Kamit is on listen only try, and Anuraj too. So I guess I'll go. Yeah, I guess I share some of the thoughts that others had echoed in terms of the feasibility of this project. I mean, the proposal itself is kind of vague, but it does get at some important problems. But the solution, it's. I mean, obviously, it's not very detailed in how they intend to build this. But I share the concern of like how will the sort of adoption of this protocol work, and it's sort of similar to. I mean, I honestly find it very difficult to sort of understand the differences between like other similar protocol, other similar decentralized services like just Farcaster, which has similar promise in your ability to sort of store and share content in a sufficiently decentralized way that they shared. But at least I felt they had built an app around it, so it's sort of they found a way to use the protocol, and they continue to make improvements. But in this one, Noosphere seems more, I mean, feels very theoretical, and I did read the sort of the background piece to just skimmed through it, and again the sort of the problems that they identified with centralization seems fair, and it seems reasonable that those are the problems to solve, but the solutions to solve those and how one can go about it is a little unclear. And in terms of the prompt itself, for some reason I don't quite think that there is a competition between sort of a multiplayer shared second brain and individual experiences. Internet sort of feels inherently multiplayer to me. Like no, I can't think of an app that would be useful, or a lot of the apps that I do use often requires other people to add. I get value because of other people being on it. So I expect that evolution to continue, wherein the individual experiences are more tailored with sovereignty over the data that's been used to tailor those experiences. So in some way, if the experiences are tailored or sort of individual experiences are sort of made based on your usage, and if there is a way to sort of create attribution of your data and creating the individual experiences could be interesting, but I can't think of how they are separate. But anyway, I'll stop there and I will pass it on to Venkat.
All right, so this is, I think, an interesting problem and almost as interesting a solution approach, I think. I think it's useful to start with what the problem actually is. So from the articles, it looks like there's two problems being solved at once. So Mayor is right that it's trying to solve all the problems on the internet at once, but they fall into two big buckets. The first, I think, is how do you structurally decentralize the underlying infrastructure? And then he has this theory of a process of like centralization and decentralization causing centralization at another level, and then you re-decentralize. So he has a mental model of how the technological evolution process works. But yeah, how do you increasingly decentralize using that process? But the other big problem he's solving is how do you think in trusted ways with trusted people around content you trust? So let's start with the second one. So if you look at constructs like the idea of a sphere containing like a bunch of like private keys that you have nicknames for that you then share with people you trust, and then you can move it around and sort of access it from anywhere because it's an IPFS. I think what that construct is trying to solve is, can you actually combine your social graph and interest graph in a way that you can robustly always connect to what you're thinking about with people you like to think about it with? And I think that addresses an actually important problem, because Web 2, I think, separated two things that can't be separated, which is we usually think of as a social graph and the interest graph. So social graph is I trust you, and interest graph is you and I are interested in the same thing. And the two are not quite the right way to think about how you trust people to work on information. So for example, I might trust somebody as a person and trust them with my keys and know they won't cheat me, but that doesn't mean I trust their thinking on, say, robotics or politics or something, right? So when you trust somebody's thinking on a topic and therefore want to kind of be connected to their content on the topic, it means you trust the process of their thinking. So even if I actually don't trust a person, maybe I dislike them, I might trust their thinking process. So like Paul Krugman, for example, he's an economist. He writes on New York Times. I find him personally annoying, but I think his writing on economics is relatively trustworthy. So that's one kind of trust relationship. Whereas other people, I might like them personally, but I might not trust their thinking on economics. So I'm not sure quite how to put them together, but one way we do that in practice in massively multiplayer sort of thinking systems, as Maya was characterizing them, is actually continuous conversation. So Twitter, for example, I think is the best example of that has existed so far in history, which is you start talking to people, and at the same time, in a very illegible way, you learn to trust them as people and trust them as thinkers on particular topics. And Twitter's graph was kind of a mix of social graph and interest graph. So what ended up happening was it was super entangled. And when Twitter started becoming untrustworthy as a centralized platform, and we all started pulling out slowly to varying degrees, we saw the problem, which is I took all my data, other people I follow took all their data, but there's no meaningful way to put the data back together to recreate the live conversation where all the trusted sort of multiplayer thinking was happening. So I don't think this problem still has been solved. So I would like a decentralized platform where I can actually put all my old Twitter archives data, and hopefully some of my friends will too, and we can recreate some of the trusted thinking community around various topics. But it's not clear how to do that. This proposal, I think, is a good starting point for doing that from scratch. Because some of the infrastructure pieces only have keys that point to the notes via memos. I think that can work some version of that scheme if it's automated enough. So I think it's not like you need infinite regress of layers and layers of indirection. I think these two layers are what you need. You need a memos layer that's basically pointers wrapped in wrappers that point to previous pointers. So it sounds complicated, but it's not. I think many programming languages already work this way. And then you have an underlying layer of notes that point to previous versions of the notes. So I think this is actually sufficiently expressive. Two layers, a pointer layer and a content layer that point to their past. I think this is enough, and many systems will have this infrastructure. And if you had this, then I think you would have something better than the Fediverse, because the Fediverse still has a problem of the Twitter's problem. So you can take your data and go away and you can have your follower graph, but you cannot recreate the conversational context on Fediverse. So if a server on the Fediverse goes down and everybody's left high and dry, and they all take their data and say, let's start a new server, and they go and upload their follower graph, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan knows more about this, but I don't think you can actually resurrect the conversation as it was happening before. So if the conversation freezes on a day and everybody with zero error downloads their archives and goes to exactly the same new Fediverse server, I don't think you can actually recreate the stream right, but maybe you can. But even if you could, the moment you introduce any imperfection, like maybe some people leave, other people join, the whole scheme falls apart. And I think this scheme is at least beginning to point towards how you could sort of get around that, which is everybody disperses, but the content is still on IPFS. And since everybody has these Sphere backpack things that contain the keys that show who you trust as people and what you trust as content, you could potentially reconstitute it. So I think there's a spectrum here from something like Twitter to Fediverse to Farcaster. I think takes it one more level of sophistication. But the end game here is actually a thing that'll actually solve the problem. It doesn't seem like infinitely far away. It seems like a finite number of iterations away. And once you do that, if you can create sort of a multiplayer mode that's agnostic to infrastructure shifts and churn in the social and content graphs, interesting things will become possible. And in terms of evolution, how far can it go? I actually think history of media technology shows that very steadily multiplayer modes outcompete individual modes. So code went from being individual to mostly being shared on GitHub, and now it's in everybody's massive second brain, which is GPT. It has digested all code on GitHub and Stack Overflow Q&A, and now it can generate code. That's what the end game has ended up with, AI in the loop. And same thing with conversations. Initially we had novels which people wrote by themselves and talked about in oral culture. Then we had the internet where people had blogs and commented on each other's stuff. Then we have things like Twitter where the hierarchy of content between authors and readers is getting increasingly blurred. And soon I think we'll have, Wikipedia is an early example of text that exists without clear authorship of who allowed the text to emerge. So I think the history of technology is it gets more and more this way, and authorship slowly dissolves and turns into sort of this collective authorship thing. So I think that's the direction it'll tend. But there's a slight twist to the tail, which is if you try to get there too quickly because you're inspired by almost the communist vision of authorship-free, sort of publicly owned, content spaces, I think you'll fail because you can't get there by, let's call it a communist path of information communism doesn't work. That's my point. And one good data point about this is I saw something recently, I forget the article, ironic, about social tokens versus NFTs. And social tokens were basically, they use the same, I think, 721 type NFTs, but social tokens is basically you own a piece of a writer. You have a claim on their output or on their time. So people run discords around social tokens. So if you buy a social token of an author, you can join the Discord. Maybe you can get some conversation time with them, and maybe you have a share of the revenue of their writing. That's a social token. They didn't ever really take off, whereas NFTs really did take off. And NFTs, what they do is they abstract away your information production and make it like a separate ownable asset. Whereas social tokens are kind of like, if you want to put a harsh spin on it, it's a kind of like voluntary digital slavery where you sell pieces of yourself. Same thing as income share agreements and things. And that tells you that you kind of have to bring a selfish individual, I don't know, market economic logic to this kind of evolution for it to work. So I think that might be the big missing piece in this whole Noosphere protocol proposal, which is how do you turn it into a marketplace that can actually get from where we are to where they want to go. Anyway, so that's my take. Sorry about going on long, and I think Sachin was also mostly listen mode. So basically, yeah, floor open for more comments by anybody.
I'll just jump in with a quick thought. Benka, as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the other problems that the problems that other folks had brought up around content distribution. And I think it was Anand had brought up some of the differences between this and Farcaster, and it occurs to me that something like Farcaster probably would work very well as a notification channel for Noosphere content, because one thing that's very unclear here is how you actually know when content has been updated. Because you can have this prior versions and IPFS handles that, but there's kind of a question of like sometimes you kind of want to know what's the state at any one time, and that gets a little bit muddier. But having a communication channel like Farcaster would not only help solve some of those state issues, but also let people kind of point to each other to things, almost like a social a search engine of sorts, which is something I've actually used to use Twitter for a lot. When I was looking for something, I would find links on Twitter, kind of like a lot of people use Reddit. So it does kind of make me wonder if you could combine this with Farcaster hubs in a way, have sort of a sphere could live in a hub, and then Farcaster could become a notification channel on top of this. Second thought, just really quick, and then I will be quiet. I suppose one way you could solve the same origin policy is that you could assign trusts to both content CIDs and individual keys. Making that work in practice, having two layers of pointers can lead to some weird behavior. It does seem to be something that's hard for people to manage. So I suspect it would fall back to one of those. And the structure of the URLs in this makes me think it will probably fall back to individual trust. So that could be one way of looking at this, is that we replace same origin with the sense of there's trust. Do I trust your thing to run code on my thing? And that maybe that is a permission level that you need within Noosphere. So those are just some thoughts I had as everyone else was talking.
I have a general question. I mean, they're obviously very excited about this protocol. And I don't understand why they're excited. I mean, yes, it solves some theoretical problem, but if somebody could explain to me why they feel so excited about it now, why is this protocol of the Noosphere something so exciting that people other than them should want to do it now? What problem does it solve? I'm missing something, I guess.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. As interesting as this is, it's hard to see where, outside of a set of kind of nerdy folks like us, um, how that's going to catch on. I think the idea that you do need some sort of showcase app is probably true here to show what this enables.
I I just want to ask, how is this different from Farcaster? It seems similar, right? What they are trying to do.
I think it's 1 degree more decentralized. Farcaster has some data persisting on chain, and the off chain data lives in hubs, and the hubs are maintained by specific people. Here, the actual content would live not in hubs, but I guess IPFS or Arweave, and be content addressed. So, content addressing, I think, does bring genuine level of, I don't know, extra level of abstraction. Because, has anybody looked into the Farcaster docs? I don't think their persistent solution is content addressing, is it? Like, how are hubs expected to store archives of stuff? Seems like traditional storage.
I think it was something called a delta graph. They have a history of things, but they update in a different way than what the Noosphere is presenting here. I'll have to look into it for more. And to answer Myra's question, I think, and I'm guessing very wildly there, I think they want to manifest some kind of critical mass for the data within the Noosphere. If they have critical mass of the data within the Noosphere, they might be able to do something with it with traditional learning algorithms, because most nodes we know of are too small in scale and unstructured to be of use. But if they can manage to harvest a Noosphere that has a sufficient large enough data points, they might be able to generate a better model than purely text. So it's kind of an extension of natural language processing, but completely decentralized.
So I would call that hope, but not excitement. So Farcaster has excitement because there's this real problems that Twitter might be falling apart. And what are we going to do? So Farcaster protocol is interesting, and maybe it solves a problem we have with Twitter. But Warpcast is something to be excited about because you're going to use it now, and it solves a problem you have now, not just some theoretical problem of will I get my data out or not, and what will I do with it. So I understand why people are excited about Warpcast. Maybe some of it's feeding into the excitement about Farcast, maybe not. But in the Noosphere, I don't know. It's just, to me at least, not so exciting that perhaps somebody will be able to collect enough information in a certain protocol to make it worthwhile for some people who 90% is enough for them to move over to it. You know, it just doesn't sound exciting, but they are excited. Okay, Gordon Bandorf, he's excited, and I don't understand why he's excited. That's my problem.
I think I do kind of get it, because if you place what he's envisioning with Noosphere on a spectrum from, say, Microsoft Word to Google Docs to Rome versus Notion, this is kind of the natural endpoint of that evolution. And if you use the current generation of notebooking software enough, I know you are not a big fan of Rome, Mayor, but if you use it enough as a second brain type software, and also if you compare them, you get a sense of like interesting trade-offs that are really frustrating. So lately for Summer of Protocols work, we've been using Notion. So I've gotten fairly deep hands-on sort of experience of Notion, and comparing it to Rome, I'm seeing like how they form almost a trade-off boundary where Rome is fundamentally much more sophisticated in the way it does transclusion, automatic backlinks, and all those clever things. And to the extent we've experienced multiplayer Rome on Yak Collective, it's obviously like at least half a generation advance on doing it on Google Docs. So if you're working on something like a single essay together, like the governance chat has been, Google Docs is better because it's fairly focused and you can all edit the same document. But the moment you get more complex, like maintaining the docs for the Yak Rover project in an interlinked way, Rome becomes better. But there's costs to that, and both of them, by the way, cite Xanadu, which I think is an vision that they're both working towards. Notion, for example, I think is much less powerful than Rome at a fundamental conceptual level, but it's much more practical. It has lots of bells and whistles. It's more performant, has less lagging and other weird problems. But at some level, Notion feels annoyingly underpowered for the purposes I want to use it for. Like, it's just not as good at creating a richly hyperlinked structure. And I think the reason these people are excited about this is they think it can break the trade-off curve that Notion and Rome are at, and like bust parse it and get somewhere. And I think one of the hints they're thinking that way is a passing comment somewhere that they say this is a cheat around Zuko's triangle. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it's that triangle of pick two of three where human memorable names, security and scalability, I believe, something like that. So human memorable names is one actual non-trivial blocker to doing things like this. And if he does come up with this sort of location and pointer separated way of like memorable names that point to content, so it could be something like @Gordon / note. It does, I think, I don't know, create an affordance that can get you past the Rome Notion state of the art. So basically, I think that's the excitement. So the Rome and Notion, I think, are third generation digital composition and notebook tools. So this would be fourth generation if these fundamental bets pay off. And that is mildly exciting to me. I'm not as excited as they are, but I'm more excited than you, Mayor.
I would be more excited if the articles were about how do we have 400 people thinking together on one of these networks. But when I read the article, I don't see anything about that. I just see how do we make sure that when people say we know who it was and find, a note somewhere. I understand it's necessary, but I don't see it, as exciting.
I think it could be exciting if they claim they can they can take 200 similar patents and make 200 more based on the new Noosphere generated by the patent.
Well, even if you have excitement, adoption matters, right? Like if now, like whatever state Twitter might be in, it's still like a decent place to find like people who are completely, let's say, different field from you. So I still like find it okay to find thoughts from people who are not in the field as I am. So all these new like Farcaster or Noosphere, It's only as good as people from different fields adopt them.
Great, we are on the hour here. Anybody have a closing thought? All right, then. See each other next week. See you.